I just wanted to say hello and welcome to all of you. Welcome to the Clean Cooking Sector Strategy webinar. My name is Samiksha Nair. I am the Senior Director of Strategy and Development at the Clean Cooking Alliance. As many of you may know, the Clean Cooking Alliance launched a sector strategy process in June of this year that is meant to really catalyze action towards universal access to clean cooking by 2030. And we're hoping that this will be the first of several opportunities where we can really share progress on the work to date and also solicit your feedback and inputs into the process as we move forward. So thank you very much for joining. As a bit of a reminder, this is the first session in the two-part webinar. The second part will be next week, and my colleague Lindsay will share a little bit more about that later in the session. But with that, we know that not everyone who intended and wanted to join was able to, so we will be recording both sessions, and we'll be sharing that more broadly with the sector and stakeholders who we've been engaging with, and those also we haven't. So yes, we look forward to getting started. Maybe we can move to the next slide, please. So I'm going to start off by giving you a little bit of an overview of the agenda for today. We're going to start off by sharing a little bit about the process behind the Clean Cooking Sector Strategy and what we've been developing. We'll then move on to sharing and presenting some of the materials and progress of the work to date before moving on to a bit of a discussion from some of the leaders from both the CCA and Dalberg sides who have been very close to the process. And then we'll close out with a preview of some next steps and what you can expect in the coming days, weeks, and the next several months. I'd like to spend a quick moment just introducing my colleagues who will be joining me today. First, again, my name is Samiksha Nair. Also from CCA, we have Divna van der Laan, our CEO. From the Dalberg side, we have Oren Ahubim, a partner. Also, Michael San, a partner at Dalberg as well. And finally, we have Lindsay Barone, who is a project manager with Dalberg. So I know many of you are joining today because you're very keen to learn what we've been up to and what progress has been made thus far. But with that being said, and while we have a lot to get through in the next hour and a half or so, we are very keen also to hear from you throughout the process. We have a few ways we'd like to suggest doing that. The first is the chat box, which you might have seen some activity in already. Please feel free to share questions, reflections, have discussions as we go through and present some of our materials. We will try to answer as many of the questions as we can in real time, but we probably won't get to all of them, but we will do our best. Secondarily, we also will be launching a few polls to get some inputs and reactions in real time to some of the materials that we're sharing from this first phase of work, and so encourage you to participate in those polls. And then finally, and most importantly, we'd like to plug the feedback survey that we shared as part of the webinar materials. This feedback survey is very much the place where you can give the most detailed feedback. We have designed it as such so that you can share, you can engage in any way, spend as little or as much time as you would like, really focus on the areas that might be most relevant or interesting to you. And we will take all of that feedback and incorporate it in the work going forward. So thanks to those who have already filled out the survey, and really would appreciate as many of you filling that out and sharing it, of course, with your networks and other people you work with so that we can get as rich and as broad a set of feedback as we can throughout this process. Perhaps moving to the next slide, please. Before we really launch into the content of the webinar, we wanted to try out our first poll. You should see it on your screen, but we know that people are joining us from all over the world. We've been engaging with many of you. Some of us are based in kind of our home camps. Others have relocated due to COVID and other circumstances. And so really looking forward to seeing who we're speaking with and where you're based today. The sector strategy is meant to be a global process, and so we are very keen to engage a really broad and diverse set of stakeholders from across several regions. And so hopefully we have that representation today, and we can keep expanding that as we move forward. We should be able to share the results as well. So let's see, we have quite a few people from North America and Europe, some from Southeast Asia and the Pacific, some people from Sub-Saharan Africa. Obviously, as people join, we might see those numbers change, but I'm glad we have a bit of a diverse representation, and hopefully that continues throughout this process. So maybe now transitioning to the official content and agenda. We're going to spend the next 10 minutes or so taking you through a little bit of the process that is behind the sector strategy. As you'll see here, the goal of this process is to be very inclusive and to engage a number of stakeholders so that we're creating a strategy that is for the sector and by the sector. We're currently at the tail end of the first phase of work. This phase is very much focused on immersing ourselves in exploring and understanding the current state of the sector, the structures, the dynamics, some of the challenges the sector has faced, some of the bright spots, what's really driving both those opportunities and challenges, and also then understanding what are some of the assumptions that are held more widely in the sector and what's behind that, what are some of those implications. As part of this process, we went quite broad in our approach for engaging stakeholders. We spoke with over 75 people from a number of categories, both from a variety of fuel and technology enterprises, from some governments both very much focused and engaged on clean cooking, as well as those that are less focused on clean cooking. We spoke to researchers, we spoke to investors and donors, we spoke to project implementers, just to name a few. We also spoke to people we're calling systems experts, and Oren will get into a little bit more about that later in this process, as well as people who are from adjacent sectors and industries. We did this through individual consultations, some co-creation workshops, and through obviously things like this, the webinar, and moving forward as well, the survey. The next phase of work is much more forward-looking. During the next phase of work, we'll focus on identifying transformations, which are essentially changes or outcomes that we're seeking to catalyze through this process. As another plug for the survey, we've included space for all of you to suggest transformations that you see as really critical to the success of the sector and to reaching universal access as we move forward. So that's one way that we will add to some of the transformations that we've started to articulate through the first phase of work. We'll also probably hold a few more consultations and a few more workshops so that we can get to a bit of a long list of some of these transformations before moving to the final phase of the strategy process, which will be about solutioning, developing solutions that can actually help us deliver on those transformations. Because we don't yet know what the transformations will be and where we will focus, we don't know exactly what those solutions will look like. They may be tools, they could be platforms or frameworks, or they could actually be processes that help to guide and galvanize a group of stakeholders that would take ownership of a particular transformation moving forward into the implementation stage of the strategy. But with that, this will be a very iterative process. In phase 3, much like phase 1, we plan to go very broad with our stakeholder engagement, both in terms of co-creating those solutions, but then also in prototyping or testing them with a number of stakeholders who would be relevant both as users of those solutions and will have touch points with them and will be critical to their success. I do want to emphasize here that the materials that we're sharing with you today are by no means the final outputs and materials of the sector strategy. As I mentioned, we're very much just at the tail end of phase 1. So the materials that we're sharing and the discussions we're having will very much center on what we found to date. And so by no means is this a final report or the end. This is very much an iterative process, and we're relatively early in the overall journey. maybe the next slide, please. Finally, before I hand things over to Oren to share a little bit more about our process, I thought it might be helpful to share some of the principles that we've anchored the design of this process in. Again, we intend for this to be a very user-centric process where heavy stakeholder engagement is critical to this. Obviously, if we would like this to be a strategy for the sector and by the sector, that is one of the cornerstones of our process to date. Also, we're hoping for the co-creation process to be very transparent. Both CCA and Dalberg are very committed to that, and we really see the strategy team as a custodian of the process rather than the creators of the strategy itself. And finally, this process is designed to really build on what has already been done and other work that's currently in progress. We by no means are creating something completely new in isolation, but we're very much hoping and intending to build off of what others are doing, and including many of you. And so very much thank you again for your participation thus far. And then maybe from here, I can hand it off to Oren to share a little bit more.
Great, thank you, Samiksha, for that, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to walk through a little bit of our initial findings, maybe giving you a sense of how we got there. Part of our process involves really trying to surface a set of insights from the conversations and convenings that we've had so far. This is meant to surface some common themes, some shared perspectives, and it's really a bottom-up process that came from primarily our interview process that we did during the first phase. It's heavy on trying to listen and understand and probe. And then we as a team had a number of sessions where we tried to do something called Affinity mapping, which tries to connect some of the insights together, some of the observations that we're hearing from sector. And as I said, it's really a bottom-up process. It's not meant to be heavily filtered, or we're not imposing on this process a lot of our incoming ideas or perspectives. It's really meant to see if we can find new ideas or new perspectives that we can raise and elevate and really think about. And through this process, we also tried to look at relationships across different actors in the sector, and that turned into the ecosystem map, which we'll talk about in a minute here. And so we shared these out in a set of outputs. We go to the next slide. Hopefully all of you, or many of you on this call, received the versions of these outputs that we've created for this first phase. If you haven't, just let us know either through the chat or after this discussion, and we can make sure to get them to you. And there were three main outputs that we had shared from this process. One is what we're calling system insights. Those were the insights that came out of the affinity mapping exercise. We expect that some of them are perhaps things that many of you can relate to. Some you might disagree with. We're really putting these out as a way to get some of that feedback and perspective from everybody in the sector. And so we don't expect that everybody will necessarily agree with everything that is there. That's part of the process. We hope that you will tell us when you think, when you have different points of view or you disagree with what we've shared. The second piece is this ecosystem map, which is meant to be a slightly dynamic version, or at least reflect some of the dynamics in the sector. It's slightly interactive, where we try to populate and provide a little bit of context as to the various actors in the map, and we'll show you that again in a second here. And then finally, the third piece is this set of systemic challenges that really bring together the ecosystem map and some of the system insights to say, how do these relate to each other? What are the relationships? What are some of the underlying root causes that might be driving some of the outcomes that we're seeing in the sector? And it really gives us a bit of a space and a framework to think about the relationships across the various stakeholders in the sector. So all of you on the line, and that's going to be really the focus of today is unpacking some of these systemic challenges and getting some of your reactions to them. So let's jump into that process. We go to the ecosystem map is the next slide. For those that were able to look at this ahead of time through the materials that we've sent out, here, this is a static view, but the version that we shared has a little bit more in it where you scroll over and learn a little bit more about the various parts of the sector. It's meant to both provide a bit of an introduction for those who might be newer to the sector, but also start to really lay out some of the relationships across the ecosystem here that we've laid out. And so we are really starting with the end users there on the left in the green, and the colors will be a little bit important as we go through and trying to understand how they do connect and access a set of cooking solutions and the broader ecosystem around that, whether it's the fuels industries or NGOs that help with implementation, et cetera. There's a set of clusters related to funding and financing and investment that really shape some of those solutions. There's, of course, the policy and advocacy environment around that, both with government as well as with international organizations that advocate for clean cooking solutions. There's a cluster of actors that provide a set of data and intelligence services that help inform the space and make investment decisions or help guide the ways in which the sector invests and learns and grows. And we've tried to be intentional in thinking about a set of adjacent and sometimes overlapping sectors to the clean cooking sector. So of course, the global health sector, the climate and environment, gender, rural development, thinking about jobs and livelihoods, enterprises, thinking a little bit more broadly around consumer goods more broadly, as well as the food and nutrition space that is important to think about. And so part of what we want to get through this process is finding those connections to adjacent sectors as well through this process. And so we wanted to really ground the exploration of this first phase of work in a broader system view, and this gives us a bit of a bird's eye view or a high level view as to what the various components of the sector entail. And we use this as really a foundation or a basis to start to think about some of the relationships across the sector, the incentives, the mindsets that really shape investment flows, information flows, et cetera. And so we're going to unpack a few of these in a moment here in what we're calling systemic challenges. And so on the next slide, we lay out a little bit of what we mean by that. And so we're going to go through a set of systemic challenges where we really think about challenges that are complex, they're really large scale. And in the clean cooking space, of course, we're dealing with 3 or 4 billion people around the world. And we really want to understand at a systemic level, what are the connections, what are the dependencies there. We spoke about the flows of information. Some of those could also be funding and investment flows, the flow of influence, the flow of learning and information across the system. And so we wanted to try to make some of those connections. And it really speaks to the need to take a more of a systems level approach to get there. And so we're going to walk through a few of these, and I urge those on the line, if there are questions, if there are challenges, if there are suggestions that you want to make, please do include those in the chat. We'll also make some time for a bit of a response to some of the questions that come up through the chat process. And we really want you to tell us what you think of this. Tell us where you agree, where you disagree, where you might have a different perspective or a different nuance, what might be missing here as we go through it. The last thing I'll say is that I think for all of us that are working in the space, we recognize that it is a complicated space. These are not simple issues. These are not simple relationships, as you all know. And so we did simplify to some extent just to make this conversation a little bit more tractable. And so we don't mean to be overly simplistic. And so let us know where you think we maybe have simplified too much. So we shared with many of you a set of 7 systemic challenges or systemic opportunities. And we're not going to go through all of them, but we want to get a sense for what you think is most important or most interesting for you to talk about. And so we're going to do another quick poll and ask you to vote. And you can select up to 3 of the 7. And so there's 7 here in the poll. And we want you to tell us what's interesting for you. And then we'll, based on these responses, we'll dig into a few of these together. We'll take a minute and select. You can select up to 3 if there are 3 that are interesting to you for us to walk through. I'm excited to see where we land here. And for those that might be on smaller screens, I'll read these very quickly. Number 1 is thinking about products and services and how to design those in a better way. Thinking about the way that donors influence and shape solutions. That's number 2. Number 3 is thinking about the policy and advocacy landscape for cooking. Number 4 is a loop around understanding how to attract new sources of investment into the sector. Number 5 is around thinking of ways that the sector can learn and innovate. Number 6 includes ways to engage the health sector more effectively. And 7 is a bit of a broader view of looking at how do we improve collaboration with a set of other adjacent sectors, for example, the climate or the gender, the food and nutrition sectors, etc. So let's see where people's interests are, and then we'll dig into some of those together. Okay, so it seems like there's a lot of interest in thinking about the first one, about designing products and services. Number 3, the policy and advocacy landscape. Number 4, attracting new sources of investments. And then it looks like 5 and 2 are also interesting to folks. So why don't we try to get through maybe 4 of these, and if there's time, we'll go with the 5th one as well. So we'll do number 1, number 2, number 3, and number 4, and if there's time, we'll get to number 5. Let me just make sure that those were the top ones. Yeah, great. So let's get into it, and we'll have a few pauses throughout to get some comments from all of you. So the first one is really, perhaps not surprising, important to think about how the sector can maybe become better at designing the types of solutions that meet the diverse needs of end users. And here, for us, it's both about how do we accelerate the adoption of clean solutions, but also importantly, the disuse of dirty fuels. As we know that pretty much everywhere in the world, whether you're here in New York where I am, or somewhere in say India, most of us, if not all of us, do use a set of different fuels for our cooking needs. And so while there are many enterprises that I think have done a really good job understanding and designing solutions, there's still a bit of a gap in terms of understanding what happens within the households around cooking and stacking behavior in particular, and maybe how do we think about making stacking a little bit more of a positive, in the sense of shifting to a cleaner set of fuels to stack with. And so maybe we can unpack this a little bit more through the ecosystem map that we've developed. So if you go to the next page, and I'll maybe set this up a little bit as it'll be similar for all of the loops that we go through. We will go through them in unpacking them in the numbered order. So looking at 1, 2, 3, and 4 here, and the colors represent the various parts of the ecosystem. So in this case, if we start with the end users, we know that for many affordability can still be a gap to access. While that's changing based on the types of innovations that the enterprises are coming up with around different business models that make affordability less of a challenge. That's still a challenge in many places. And we do see many enterprises investing in user research to really try to understand what are the right products, what are the right use cases for their customers. And in many cases, there's a lot of success there, but those tend to be somewhat more segmented in terms of their applicability. And so there's still a bit of a gap in terms of understanding what really drives the most value to households. Is it efficiency in the fuel usage? Is it the reduction in the emissions in the home or in the kitchen? Is it the durability and the safety? All of these are of course important, but making sure that the design and innovations really target those types of needs that users have. And so if we look on the other hand, on the other side, thinking about the ways in which behavior change campaigns can help support some of those innovations, and how do you drive sustained usage of cleaner solutions and disuse of the dirty fuels. And I think, optimistically, we are seeing quite a bit of innovation here, and we think that data and a number of data initiatives are helping to make the design challenges perhaps less pronounced. And so whether it's the multi-tier framework data from the World Bank or the data efforts of SE for All, as well as many enterprises that collect household level data and usage data, all of these are really starting to really change the way in which we understand usage, and we can potentially design better solutions for households. So maybe pausing and taking a little bit of a step back, if there are some thoughts from the audience, maybe we can try to address them. Samiksha, did you want to chime in?
Absolutely. Maybe I can share a couple of the questions that we're getting in. One is cash distribution or affordability part of the end user analysis?
So we want to be certainly transparent. Is at this stage we've talked to some end users, but this has not been really the focus, and so we're using a lot of our existing understanding of cash challenges and affordability, and certainly as many of those on the call know, for some of these solutions there can be higher upfront cash costs, but those business models are starting to change. There are pay-as-you-go models, there are different service models, and so certainly that's a part of it. But we do see quite a bit of change in that space, and it's exciting to see ways in which that can continue to become less of a barrier going forward.
Fantastic. Maybe another question from the chat. Are there a handful of design solutions that have worked, maybe from other sectors as well as the clean cooking sector? And how many do we really need?
Ooh, well, certainly in our view, there are a number of design innovations that have worked, certainly at the business model level. If we look at, again, different pay-as-you-go options. But also, if we look at the appliances or sort of the fuels themselves, design does play a really important part. I think the challenge has been finding the right types of design innovations that households actually value and will make purchasing decisions around. And I think that's where innovations that are designing for perhaps longer-term health benefits, we don't necessarily see as much uptake. Those that design for reducing sort of the day-to-day costs of purchasing fuel, or perhaps sort of the use of electricity or LPG, some of those tend to be perhaps gaining some traction. But this is a bit of a kind of innovative space, and so I think we're excited to see where we go from there. We are going to ask some questions to all of you as well as we go through this, just to get a little bit of a sense for what seems to be sort of resonating or most relevant to you. So maybe we'll start with the first question on this challenge here. So we we ourselves are a bit optimistic, or at least are seeing a set of new data initiatives coming up, and so we want to get a sense, how strongly do you agree with the statement that I am optimistic that new data initiatives and technologies are sufficient to help the sector better understand and design for the diverse needs of end users. And so of the new initiatives that you are aware of, or the new technology innovations, do you think that these are sufficient for improving our understanding of users? And for those that have a strong point of view on here, we hope you will share it with us. We recognize that some of these questions may not be relevant for everybody that's listening, so feel free to not answer if you don't want to answer, but definitely if you have a perspective, we'd love to hear from you. And we'll try to make these relatively quick, so we'll give you maybe 20, 30 seconds to think it through, and then we'll kind of do a quick share, and then we'll move on to the next one. All right, so let's see what you all think. So there's a bit of a spread. Those that a little bit more around the agree or strongly agree, but there's still some skepticism here around these. Either they might not be perhaps sufficient or as widespread. So it's good to get a sense of some of those perspectives. Thank you for sharing. Great. So let's move on to the second system loop. This one is really about the role of donors and funders in the space, and we'll see what everybody thinks about this view here. The view that we've synthesized here is thinking about some of the perhaps outsized influence that donors and funders have on the solution landscape, and while in over maybe the last decade, there has been more of a focus on improved, say, biomass or tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 type solutions. We do seem to see a bit of a shift in the dialogue or the interest level around the tier 4, tier 5 solutions. Here, I'm talking in terms of the sort of emissions profiles of various clean cooking solutions. When I'm thinking of these tiers, we know that there's multiple ways to think about, or the multidimensionality of various tiers, but here we're really focusing on the emissions level of cooking solutions. And while this is not a universal shift, we are starting to see it, and there's maybe a bit of a concern among some that we might be leaving perhaps those that are least able to afford the cleanest solutions behind, and that perhaps we need to at least and be thoughtful about that. And can we do both? Can we make cleaner solutions more affordable, and then affordable solutions cleaner, as one funder put it for us? And so perhaps the big question is, how do we prioritize across the various investments that donors and other funders are making? And so if we turn to the ecosystem map view of this and try to get a sense for what might be driving some of these dynamics. Again, we'll start with the users on the next slide. And we do know that there is quite a range of users and user types. Typically, we know in cities and urban centers, there tends to be higher access to a range of different solutions. Oftentimes in more rural or peri-urban settings, because of less access to infrastructure, whether it's electricity or other infrastructure, the solutions there might be more limited, and that really then shapes the types of solutions that maybe donors and other funders have traditionally favored, whether it's historically around improved biomass solutions, and perhaps more in the last couple of years, a bit of a shift towards different solutions that are perhaps higher on the or lower on the emissions profile, and part of that is perhaps a bias within the SDGs and SDG 7 in particular, around clean access to clean cooking solutions, and the way that donors and funders are starting to think about that, and maybe a bit of some fatigue around some of the solutions that have been tried over the last decade that maybe haven't achieved as great of an accelerated impact as maybe many have hoped. And so we do know that SDG 7 does set a fairly high bar for solutions, which we think is important to do. But the challenge really is making sure that the sector can help deliver those clean solutions to all of the end users. So let's get some of your thoughts on this as well. So make sure, I don't know if there are some questions that have bubbled up around this that we want to pause on.
Yeah, not questions, but a few comments that were shared. One was that too many times we're focused on technologies we know or that donors ask us to promote, i.e. we should not have blind trust in predetermined technologies and solutions. We have a couple of other comments more related to the previous system loop as well. I don't know if you'd like to respond to that, Oren, a little bit.
Sure. Maybe give me a few and we'll try to kind of weave them in as we go.
This one was I think more directed to the previous system loop, but John Mitchell shared that he's not sure that data initiatives and technologies are similar enough to group together in the first poll question. He said actually if we split that out, perhaps we get different results. We have another comment that from Nina saying that she thinks that the tier discussion is strongly linked to what type of setting we're talking about. High-end tier 4 solutions can work in more developed contexts and need one type of donor approach, whereas, including tier options, whereas reaching the poorest who have limited ability to pay needs perhaps other approaches.
Yeah. So I appreciate those comments and reflections. I think let me maybe start with some of the ones around tiering. I do think it's an important conversation to have. I think what we're trying to do is not necessarily sort of impose a set of technological solutions on users. We know, for example, in many rural settings, if you can really push for electrification in those settings, that electric cooking might be a really good solution there, or at least one of the solutions that might be there. And we know that whether it's ethanol or biogas or LPG, some of the more cleaner burning fuels do have application in many rural settings as well. And so I do think that context, of course, matters, and it matters a lot. I think, but if we're maybe being very serious about SDG 7 and achieving that goal, we have to maybe free ourselves from the constraints of what we know has worked. I think this was a comment also in the chat that we do sometimes push for the solutions that maybe have worked in the past, and some of those are the right solutions, but certainly there's a lot of new solutions that can be coming out, and so there needs to be more, we think, or innovation around that solution space, so that we're not just saying, biomass is going to be it for this group, or ethanol will be it for this group. I think that's really up for those households to make those decisions based on what's available and accessible to them. But appreciate these comments. Obviously, we're not going to be able to touch on all of these. I will ask again, or put a plug in again for the feedback survey that we've shared. And again, if you haven't received that, let us know and we'll send you the link. And we do want to create spaces for you all to share your thoughts in a much sort of deeper or lengthier way than through the chat boxes. But hopefully this gets us a good start into that. So maybe a quick question for you all on thinking about some of this. Do you believe that funders or investors overemphasize clean fuel solutions over improved solutions? And here, I know these can be some loaded words. I think we want to sort of think more broadly beyond just sort of stoves and fuels, but certainly, or traditionally, we think of electricity, ethanol, LPG, biogas as more of the clean fuel solutions, and some forms of maybe advanced biomass stoves. But there are quite a range of solutions that sort of maybe fall short of the cleanest in terms of the emissions profile, but that do provide significant value in terms of energy efficiency improvements, time savings, health improvements, health benefits, et cetera. And so those tend to be more improved and improved on a range of issues, and do actually provide quite a bit of value to households. So I want to get a sense for how you all think about the clean and improved conversation. So let's see what some of the solutions are. Okay, so a bit of a probably within the margin of error here in terms of a bit of an even split across that. So so it's good to get a sense that there are quite a bit of divergent views on this. Great. So let's go to the number 3, which was also high on the list, really thinking about the policy and advocacy landscape. Here, the challenge that we wanted to point out is one around coordination and finding the ways in which sector-wide there could be greater coordination around policy and advocacy. We know that it's challenging at the national level. You have multiple ministries that that play a role, whether it's the energy or the environment or health ministries or other ministries, rural development. And so there isn't often a single sort of home where policy is discussed or developed at the national level. We do have sort of some of the global forum, perhaps some of the national and regional fora are can play a bigger role there. So what is really the way to get a stronger and more coordinated policy and advocacy effort to help drive large-scale transformation? So if we look at this in terms of how it plays out in the system, we know that for policy and advocacy to really work, you do need to have the system really supporting itself. So on the one hand, you do have a set of fragmented cooking or energy. The agenda there can be quite fragmented, and so there isn't always a coherent sense of ownership within government or within policymakers. So that's sort of the first challenge there. But also, if we look at the end users as a sort of a political force or as a mobilized force, we don't see cooking end users as particularly active or as strong advocates in that loop. And so that connection between users and governments there that we show in the dashed line is not as strong, providing that reinforcement around sort of demanding the right sets of policies or actions around clean cooking. We do have a set of national and regional clean cooking alliances. They're not as numerous. Perhaps not all of them are as well resourced in order to do the work that they do. We do have industry associations, and increasingly over the last few years, we are starting to see them play a bit of a stronger role in policy and advocacy. And we're seeing new ones emerging around different fuels and different types of solutions. And we have there at the bottom a set of global clean cooking advocates who are working sort of both at the global level, working with industry, working also at the national level. And so for this whole system to work, everybody needs to do their part and do it well. And we do see a few breaks in that system where there isn't as much mobilization, say, from end users or at the national level for action to happen. Let me pause there and maybe get some reflections from the group on how they see some of the challenges in the policy and advocacy landscape.
Well, one question that we have is, where national transformations have happened, what has spurred them?
Yeah, it's a really important question. I think it varies from place to place. I think almost everywhere there is a strong sort of policy agenda at the national level. So you might have champions, you might have very strong ministries, you might have a president or or a vice president or a prime minister or a first lady that really takes this on to be a part of an agenda that's really critical to them. And so I think you do need to have really a lot of these factors in place: strong government that is driving that agenda, industries or enterprises that are there to really provide and deliver the right types of solutions. Where we've seen large fuel transition programs in places such as Indonesia, for example, you did have a bit of a focus on a particular fuel transition. And so you need to have a number of these factors really in place to make the system kind of work together.
That's great, Oren. I think in terms of trying to get to more of the loops, maybe we can move on to the poll.
Great, let's do that. So the question here, what, if anything, is needed to elevate the clean cooking agenda within national government? And you can pick as many of these choices as you want. And there's also the choice at the end there for those that might think that elevating the agenda is maybe not an important thing for us to focus on. Perhaps there's skepticism in terms of the efficacy of national government programs.
From the chat, we also have a comment that to strengthen the voice of end users, it's important to empower civil society organizations. But unfortunately, there have been a few programs that actually enable this.
And I'm looking at these the options that we put here, and perhaps including civil society organizations as a voice is an important one. So thank you for that. It's something that we should be looking into more. So it seems there's quite a bit of emphasis around building political will and government capacity. So really making this a politically salient or politically important. And then the second one around establishing the capacity of national and regional clean cooking champions. So maybe the civil society groups might be part of that champion building. And then also engaging industry associations seems to be something that perhaps is a lever of influence on government as well. And also mobilizing end users. So a lot of these, perhaps one learning is that most of us do think it is important to elevate the agenda within national governments. So we do have time for one more of these, and then we do want to kind of open it up a little bit more for some reflections as well. So maybe we jump to let's do number 4, which was I think a big one for folks really thinking about the importance of raising sufficient capital from both private as well as public sources. We can put sort of philanthropic sources in there as well. And this is a tricky one. You know, we know that somewhere between $4 billion to $10 billion a year is necessary to be invested. Some estimates can go as high as $100 billion a year if we're really thinking about making the cleanest solutions much more affordable. Perhaps subsidies might be needed to help bring those costs down. And we know that only a small fraction of that is actually mobilized every year or invested. And part of this has to do with some of the challenges the sector has faced, some of the perhaps reputational challenges around the commercial viability of certain solutions. And so one of the ways that we can start to change that narrative or change that discussion to really drive additional resources into the sector. So if we think of this within our ecosystem framing, the big focus here is going to be on the funding and financing part of that. So if we go to the next slide, please. You'll see a lot of this is, or all of it here really is within one of the subsectors there. And it's one of the more perhaps complicated set of actors here. We do know that overall commercial or impact investment into the sector is limited. It's insufficient. I will say though, if we take a broader view, and this is something that we have heard a few times during some of the interviews and discussions we've had, if we think also of perhaps the electricity sector, we do know that investments into electrification are quite significant, and so it's not only in terms of cleaner fuels or cleaner stoves. If we expand that out into the broader infrastructure that delivers clean cooking, we do know that there's quite a bit of investment that goes into that. At the same time, if we look at international donors, including foundations, they have traditionally been one of the largest sources of capital for the sector, and that's really been, frankly, insufficient in terms of the scale or the magnitude of the investment that's needed. We asked ourselves what might be underlying that. Is it some of the unit economics of many traditional businesses are challenging, or maybe still somewhat unproven? That again is starting to change, or has been changing. If you look at some of the models that try to lower the upfront costs, those tend to improve the unit economics. But there is a bit of a perception challenge as well. So funders have long-standing perception around, we spoke about this, the challenges of designing the right solutions for end users to deliver significant uptake and usage. There have been some high-profile maybe failures around some big investments that have been made, and so a question about what is the return on investment for the sector. But there are also some bright spots. There are some enterprises that are monetizing things such as carbon finance or carbon offsets as a revenue stream. There's a potential perhaps for carbon to unlock additional capital. This is something that we want to unpack and learn more about. Is this a real opportunity, or are these markets still nascent and challenging there? And are there new technological innovations there around smart metering, sensors that can help unlock significant carbon finance or other types of maybe results-based financing that is waiting to be crowded into the sector? So this is a bit of a summary or a synthesis view of the challenges related to capital raising or investment more broadly. What are some of the maybe questions or comments that have come up through the chat that we can try to address?
I think this is a complex one, and so we don't have any immediate comments from the chat. One just came in. International public finance is still not at the level that is required. The sector requires risk-taking, grants, and concessional funding to stimulate market demand and foster private sector engagement in supply. Innovative incentives are required to develop a viable and ultimately sustainable commercial market for clean cooking solutions. It would be good to reflect the critical role of international public finance on this slide.
Thank you for that. So sounds like we might be missing a perspective around that, and I think the comments around risk taking are important. I think many in the sector will agree that that perhaps the risk tolerance is too low, and that to really have breakthroughs around new products and services and business models and engagement models, that we do need to perhaps have a different risk reward calculation. I think one area that we didn't get to today is also thinking about learning and how does risk and understanding that with risk there does come failure, but with failure there comes a lot of learning, and how can we be better as a sector in capitalizing and aggregating and coordinating around that learning in a way that drives greater sort of next rounds of investments. So let's pause there. We'll do maybe a final a poll question, and then I think we will move on. So here's another multiple choice. You can select 3 of these. So in your experiences, what are some of the biggest challenges to raising capital or investment? Which are the most pressing? And we have enterprises have proven to be too risky, to the risk question or comment that was just made. Investors and funders have been turned off by the negative reputation of the sector. Investors and funders do not have sufficient knowledge about the industry or the sector to make good investments. There are barriers to measuring and reporting impact, and that prevents some investors and funders from engaging. There are too few investors and funders that have prioritized clean cooking as part of their portfolio. We know that there are many clean energy investors, and maybe cooking isn't prioritized within those broader clean energy portfolios. And then finally, carbon finance markets are nascent. They're too young and early, and are not accessible for many clean cooking enterprises. And there might be others. So what do you think are the most pressing, maybe two most pressing challenges that we really need to get right to help address this challenge of capital raising?
Maybe, Oren, while we wait for those results, another comment saying that it would be interesting to do an analysis about the success rate and profitability of investments in the sector to date, and maybe also interesting to compare that to other adjacent sectors.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, this, so we, seems like there's a small majority really focusing on the challenge of investors and funders don't have sufficient industry knowledge. That's in some ways maybe cause for hope in that providing information and knowledge building is something that the sector can do and probably can do well. There's the second one around too few investors and funders have prioritized clean cooking as part of their portfolio. Some of the things that we've heard a few times is if you think about off-grid solar or solar home systems, those are spaces that tend to receive more funding and maybe are a little bit easier to understand from a cash flow perspective or from an investment perspective. And so some of these, and then there's a lot of around risk being too high and some of the negative reputation of the sector. So a bit of a spread here as well. Right. So thank you for letting me talk at you for 30 minutes here. I hope this gets those on the line at least interested and excited in these. There's a few other loops here. Again, we've shared some of these, or we've shared all of these with many of you. And if you haven't received them from us, let's make sure if you're interested in providing more feedback on those, that we'll get those to you. So where do we go from here? As Samiksha said in the beginning, we just wrapped up phase one of the work, really trying to understand the current state of the sector. We're now shifting to thinking about the future state. What is the vision that all of us have for how the sector can evolve and grow? There are three steps or three parts to this. The first is really getting the feedback and the perspectives from all of you into some of the materials that we've synthesized. We'll put in another ask for those that can provide their perspectives through the feedback survey. And we really want to iterate on this. As Samiksha said, these are not final deliverables by any means. These are only sort of the starting inputs into really thinking about the future state. And we're starting to really think about what transformations are needed for the sector to make. And we want to understand from all of you what you think some of those transformations are. We have some ideas that came out of the first phase of work, but we want to broaden that set and understand what's the long list, and then start to really prioritize, and then building some strategy concepts that come out of that. And we don't know exactly what those will look like today, since they will need to be responsive to the transformations that we all collectively identify. But some of those might be specific tools. Some of those might be bigger processes or movements or collective action that we will need to take together with many of you. And so we will be coming back to all of you with a set of those concepts and testing them with you and asking you to help build those with us. so that we know they are well suited for all of you, because really everybody on this call, you are the users of the strategy, and so we want to make sure that it's built for you and with you in mind. So let's take a pause, or we'll pivot now, and I'll hand it off to my colleagues to provide some of their thoughts and reflections on some of the phase one learnings that we've had, and we'll learn from two leaders in the space that have spent a lot of time really thinking about some of the solutions here.
Thank you, Oren. Great. So before we wrap the session today, we wanted to just spend a little bit of time with two of the leaders that have been involved in this work so far. So we're joined by Dimna Vanderland from the Clean Cooking Alliance, as well as Michael Zahn, who is a partner at Dalberg. Both of them have been involved in the work from its inception, and obviously both know the clean cooking sector very, very well. So wanted to just walk through, and we have a couple of questions that I'll be asking to each of you about your reflections on some of the insights that have come out of this work, as well as just the process and what we're sort of learning as we're progressing through this. Hopefully we'll have some time at the end for any questions from the audience. So again, if people want to share their questions in the chat box, we'll do our best to get to as many of those as we possibly can. Great. So Dimna, I'll start with you. Designing a sector strategy is certainly a very ambitious and sort of aspirational endeavor. I'm curious to know why did the Clean Cooking Alliance feel like this was an important initiative for the sector?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks, Lindsay. And I do agree, it's an ambitious intention and process that we've started, but I strongly feel that if, as a sector, we're not ambitious in how we think through the next 10 years, we are never going to reach that ambitious goal that we've collectively set ourselves. And so I think with an ambitious goal comes an ambitious way of thinking, what is currently stuck in the sector? What is not working? What have we learned from what is not working? And how can we collectively, and with an increasing sense of understanding who is doing what in the sector, how can we collectively really become more ambitious and increase our sense of urgency around what's needed to shift this sector and to collectively make sure that we achieve that very ambitious goal of universal access to clean cooking by 2030. And when we started the process, I wasn't really sure how it was going to work and what we were going to learn along the way, but it's challenging, yes. But it's also incredibly needed. And so it's a little bit based in a sense of humility that as an individual or as an individual organization, we cannot achieve this by ourselves. And so to bring together the whole sector and be really focused on the co-creation of this sector strategy is at a personal level very important to me. But I think also, and I'm hoping through these kind of engagements for the whole sector, increasingly seen as something that is needed to shift us towards solutions and collaboration that we really need in the sector. And so we're at an inflection point, I think. We see a lot of really interesting and strong initiatives that are in the sector that we're following and we're building up on. But we're also at an inflection point that suggests stronger momentum and stronger action and collaboration across the sector. So I think it's a very exciting moment to be in this sector, and I'm looking forward to the next two phases of our work as we work with all of our partners to continue to define what that strategy looks like and what those different solutions are going to be that we will be working on. And so in the next phase of work, we also want to be really clear, and I think we've articulated this, that CCA and Dalberg are like the stewards of this process. We don't own the outcomes of any of this, and so it's a sense of like we are in service of the sector as we work through this the sector progress or sector strategy. So yeah, it's challenging and it's ambitious, but it's also exciting and needed.
Absolutely. Earlier in the presentation, one of the comments that was made about the process is how we are intentionally trying to build on some of the work that's already been done by the sector. Mike, I'm interested to hear from you how exactly the process does that, as well as maybe what are some of the learnings that have come out of this initial phase of work that build on what you thought you already sort of knew to be true about clean cooking?
Thank you, Lindsay. That's a good question. I think in terms of process, so as Samiksha mentioned earlier, I think as Dimpna mentioned as well, this was meant to be complementary to existing initiatives, but also additive, right? We're trying to get to some new stuff, and we're trying to work differently. Probably in three notable ways. One is new voices. So this involves talking to skeptics, people who think the sector is dead-ended or not doing the things it should be doing, but also talking to truly new voices who are not part of the sector today. Secondly, it's a design approach, right? So it's not starting with hypotheses. It's actually letting the hypotheses emerge as you really dig into the views of the stakeholders. And thirdly, it's a systems view. So it's looking at the root causes, and that's a lot of what Oren was describing, but also asking some tough questions on the institutions that currently exist in the sector. Are they doing the right things? Or even, do we have the right institutions? Are there some gaps? Are there some things we're missing that are needed to move the sector forward? So taking a systems view. So that's in terms of process. I think in terms of what's new, in terms of substance that's starting to emerge, at least what's new for me. So to be frank, some of what we're learning isn't necessarily new, but it's still important as it reinforces some of the observations that have been in the ether. For example, the importance of data and end user insights to unlock the sector, and the importance of potentially higher investment, both in the public sector and the private sector, which is, I think, most of us who've been tracking the sector believe is just existential. But some stuff is, I think, genuinely new, and to me falls into a few categories. So one is around adjacent sectors, and I'm sure we'll come back to this question, which is, the challenge and the opportunities for building links to other sectors in meaningful ways and working with adjacent sectors in meaningful ways. So this is climate, it's forestry, it's health, and also the jobs agenda. So how do you move cooking from the periphery much more to the center in those sectors? Second theme for me that's new, or new in the way it's getting fleshed out, is around the role of industry. So the opportunity to engage industry in new and meaningful ways. This includes fuels, ethanol, LPG, processed biomass, but also, very critically, how to work with the broader electric energy world, off-grid, mini-grid, and on-grid utilities. Third, government engagement and political will elevation. I'm not going to go into that in detail, but again, how do you harness that in new ways? And how do you capacitate and put some structure around the way that governments engage in this issue? And then lastly, this culture of innovation and learning. Some of that is around data, some of it is around questions of structured technology R&D, but also this question of risk-taking and business models. So those are kind of the four areas where I think we are getting to some new insights. Of course, the question is, how do you then structure some interventions and programs, structures, maybe institutions that begin to address those insights?
Yeah, maybe to build on that quickly, if I can, Mike, I think the sort of the emerging narrative around adjacency and other sectors that the clean cooking sector should be thinking through how to engage. It's so interesting because in a way, none of them are really adjacent. In a way, all of them are overlapping. So if you think about the health sector, like that is overlapping. If you think about sort of the food and nutrition, that is fundamentally what we're talking about here. And so it's a little bit of a shift, I think, within our sector as well, to not always isolate ourselves and really extend our way of speaking to the issue that is much more compelling to really embrace the fact that this is fundamental to families and their livelihoods. And so that sort of shift in narrative and how we can become much more effective and efficient in that as a sector, I think is, to me, very exciting. And we have to be thoughtful and careful when we design that outreach and when we design these much more global strategic partnerships with some of these other sort of adjacent sectors, because we can't do all of that at the same time in the exact same way. There's very different needs that are gonna sort of emerge as we explore it a little bit further in the coming weeks and months. But it's exciting because I think we as a sector have always said that that is what we do, but we haven't shown enough action towards it, and we haven't been deliberate in literally moving in that direction. And I think there is really an opportunity to do that right now. And I think that that's sort of the bringing together of that holistic view of what is needed at the family, at the household level is very exciting to me. And I want to just quickly reflect on one of the questions that I saw coming up already around COVID-19 and how that is going to impact how we think about the sector strategy. And it's a little bit of the same answer, I think, because we have to think about that in a systemic way, and the impact of COVID-19 for the businesses, for the policymakers, for physical allocation or allocation of very scarce resources, the country level, all of that's going to really impact how we think about the clean cooking sector, and how we continue to have to focus on really being deliberate in our own allocation of our own scarce financial resources, because it's going to get squeezed and squeezed and squeezed with COVID-19, and how that is really redirecting some of the funding, the current funding out there. And so, yes, it will have a significant impact on the clean cooking sector, and not just on us, as we all know, across the different industries and sectors that other people are working on as well.
And just a quick plug, the follow-up webinar for today's event is actually a panel discussion we're having next week with some new voices in the space, including a couple of folks who will be joining us from overlapping or adjacent sectors to speak a little bit about what that intersection might actually look like, and how we actually can sort of effectively catalyze more integration. Another point that I think has come up quite central to the work that we're doing, we've heard numbers around, somewhere between $4 to $10 billion US that are required annually to achieve universal access by 2030. Given some of the challenges that have been discussed today, Mike, maybe I'll start with you. Where does this sector start in working towards this number?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big gap. We sized the big gap as part of the recently released MAX report. I'm sure not surprising to anyone who's been tracking the sector for a while. So I guess different ways to answer the question. The first is, just broadly speaking, I think funding will continue to be a challenge. And I think it is an existential challenge for the sector, especially if we talk about the high bar of universal access to clean cooking, and especially if we talk about getting access to the households that spend little or no money on cooking fuels today. And that, depending on the region you're sitting in, is between 20 to 50%, right? It's a big population. And so without some sort of structured way of approaching that and a lot more public finance, you're not going to crack that. So there are positive trends, amount of funding being injected by investors into some of the startups in the sector, funding by development sector, including a lot of the RBF activity by some of the folks I'm seeing here on the attendee list. And as from the development sector, and then climate funding, it's all increasing, but from a very small base. So the question is, how do you get that to that 100-fold increase in funding that we need? Because that's not what we're seeing just yet. And so where will the funding come from? I mean, I think the honest answer is, I don't think we know. I think that's still something that we're looking into as part of this process. And of course, the question that we're going to continue as a sector to have to look at in the next few years. But we do have some ideas, and I'd be very curious to hear some reflections from the group, from the audience in the chat window. In terms of the how, the crux is probably demonstrating success along a few different pathways. So whether it's fast-growing startups that hit substantial scale, show a strong kind of economic arbitrage that's embedded in their model, and build a strong business case, that's in terms of private sector investment, or it's success at national scale that build political will and get other governments to replicate. But in terms of where one looks for funding, I think first, a few hypotheses, right? So the first is looking externally. Where are the big pools of money? We think that climate finance may be the one place to explore. So this is going beyond carbon finance and looking at kind of moments of influence in the climate finance sector, such as the upcoming COP26, right? Can you move the agenda? Can you put clean cooking on that agenda much more firmly? Other external sources of funding, through RBFs, getting into health, gender, deforestation, biodiversity funding, or jobs funding. Jobs agenda is going to be huge. It was already huge. It's going to be even bigger as part of post-COVID rebuilding and response. And so both in terms of formal employment and mass entrepreneurship, can we link clean cooking to that story through some sort of a green jobs positioning? Second, we can look at the edges of the system, right? So existing system, and there to me, the most interesting thing personally as a possibility is investment from various industries, especially the fuels industry. And then thirdly, it's within the current ecosystem. Where to me, I think it's about business model innovation that can unlock funding or facilitate the unlocking of funding, whether it's through kind of business models like pay as you go, or business models that dramatically reduce verification costs through fuel metering and device metering, so that RBF and other funds can more easily engage with the sector. So those are a few areas that I think are interesting to explore. We don't have the answer, but very curious to get some engagement from the audience on, where will these billions come from? Where should we look for these billions?
Mm-hmm. Can I just add something to that really quickly, Lindsay, before we go to some of the comments? It's the biggest question, right? And like, if we can't figure some really good solutions here, if we can't figure that out, then it's going to be really, really difficult to stay ambitious and deliver on that ambitious goal. And so the other nuance there is obviously that as much as we always say that none of the cooking solutions are fit everywhere and they need to be adjusted to local circumstances, and they have to, financing has as well. Like financing and thinking through financing programs collectively at a country level in Kenya are going to be different than they are in China or India, or they're going to be different than how they're going to be in Nepal and Haiti. And so I just want to make sure that as we continue in this process, we are very conscious, sort of bifurcating some of these archetypes in how you think about holistic financial planning to do energy transition at a country level. And so it sort of comes back a little bit to like, this isn't just about planning for financial or our ability to finance clean cooking solutions. That has to be integrated in broader energy planning. And so that complication, I think, is exciting and allows for us to be creative in how we think about how we're engaging with different countries in the next months and years.
Great. And before my final question, we have a few comments and questions have come up in the chat window that I think address this issue of sort of last mile and thinking about what it takes to sort of ensure that we're serving the last mile, or we're sort of taking a, that no one is sort of left behind approach. And so a couple of questions here around, there was a question, I think, specifically for you, Dempna, around what de-risking mechanisms are currently being prioritized by the CCA to encourage more private sector engagement, particularly with the leave no one behind in mind. And then a slightly divergent view, I think, as well, shared by others, which is thinking about, is that really where the focus should be? And instead, should we be thinking about targeting maybe first clients who can pay for the services in order to engage into a path of democratizing access rather than trying to encompassing from inception, be all-encompassing from inception? And then kind of referencing some of what happened in microfinance and off-grid, maybe not targeting the poorest of the poor, but instead over time, making sure that we sort of work to that segment. And certainly, if we assume that resources for the sector will still somewhat be scarce, maybe an important trade-off that we need to figure out how we approach that.
Yeah, no, it's an important question, and I'm going to answer it not wearing the head of CCA hat, but the person who is engaging in the sector strategy. And so I think you cannot design a sector strategy without thinking through the whole population, right? And so as CCA, yeah, we have a unique contribution to make to a certain part of that market, a certain segment of that market. And in our case, we are indeed thinking carefully through how we engage with some of the very promising businesses that are out there already, because we do think that sustainable business models have a high likelihood of reaching scale. And so our theory of change is really focused on how do we create scale through these businesses so that we can continue to grow the market. That does not mean that the clean cooking sector, the sector strategy work itself, does not think carefully about how do you then make the interventions work for the whole sector. And so I think as we go through the next weeks and months, then indeed other organizations will be brought in, and other viewpoints will be brought in to make sure that it is as comprehensive, the sector strategy is as comprehensive as we can make it to be.
Absolutely. And another interesting comment, the most important thing that CCA can do is to lobby and market the many DFIs, donors, and investors who are currently not committed to funding cook stoves. As Michael stated, we need to highlight the successes to change the narrative with these funders so that they will look at cook stoves again. Dimna, one of the insights that came out of this was around sort of the narrative and sharing successes. Interested to just get your take on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And it's the notion that this is a sector where people have worked really hard for many, many years to try to fix it or address the issue. And sometimes that worked and sometimes it didn't. And so I think that the sort of the attention and sort of one of the things that Orange shared that for the donors and the financing slide speaks to this point. Like, there is skepticism for some of these organizations that are indeed funding large programs that focus on clean energy and renewable energy and energy transition. And so our job as not just CCA, but others in the sector is to make sure that that narrative to these kind of organizations continues to be, there is potential here. We can figure this out. And through this clean cooking sector strategy, we are going to figure this out. And so, yeah, absolutely. The storytelling, the compelling narrative around it are going to be really, really important over the next period of time. And personally very committed to that, and really also like need other voices in the sector to bring those stories to light and find compelling and powerful voices to do that. Like, it cannot be the people on this call even, like there has to be other voices that we need to bring into that compelling narrative and storytelling.
And maybe just to jump in and add, I mean, I think it's really important to highlight again that this is not a CCA strategy. This is a sector strategy. In some cases, the answer may be CCA doing certain things, which will almost certainly will be in some cases. But then even for this question of funding, right? I think there's also a question of what does the whole sector do? What do the various other institutions in the sector do to get that funding to begin to flow? And are we missing some mechanisms and some institutions to start to unlock that?
Yeah, great. And I want to make sure we're wrapping up close to time, so this will be my final question. We're at a very important inflection point in this process. We're coming out of the initial phase of work, and we're starting to now transition into thinking about what the sector strategy will actually look like. And so I'm curious to hear from both of you, what are some of the learnings that have come out of this process so far? But maybe also just put ourselves on the spot about kind of one particular thing that I know we've been discussing quite a bit around the process as a team, is really around cultivating diversity and representation. So in the poll that we had at the beginning of this session, certainly, you know, this event is leaning very heavy towards North America, Europe. I'm curious to hear some thoughts in terms of how we're making sure that we're being truly sort of representative in this process.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think maybe sort of to start off the answer of that final question, to thank everybody who's already participated in this process. And so personally, I'm super grateful for that. And I know a lot of people have already spent significant amount of their time to engage with this process, and really hope that people will continue to do so. by filling out the survey, but then also engaging as we go through the next weeks and months in this process. I don't think it can be understated just how complicated and interesting these kind of sector strategy processes are, and that we are not shying away from divergent views and really welcome those and really want to make sure that we bring in those different viewpoints. And I'm very aware of the fact that this is still very focused on Europe and North America, and we are indeed actively looking to see how we can broaden it out and try to do with some of that with the timing of today's session. But we'll continue to really make sure that we are very deliberate about how we engage with other parts of the sector and how we bring those voices into the conversation.
Great. Well, thank you so much to both of you for participating in this discussion and sharing a little bit about kind of your thoughts on the insights and process so far. Maybe before we quickly wrap up, wanted to just give everyone a little bit of a sense of the next steps for this process. So as we mentioned, we have shared a feedback survey with all of you, which will allow you to share very sort of detailed feedback and thoughts. People have been really engaged in the chat window today. Thank you so much, but would encourage people maybe to share some of those thoughts in the feedback survey with all of us. We'll take all of those and we'll use that to refine the materials that we presented today, as well as to start thinking a little bit about how we're going to apply some of that to our thinking about the future state of work. We've shared the link for the survey in the chat window, so you can click that, and through the survey you can actually access all of the materials that we have shared for the session or prior to the session in detail. Moving into the next phase of work, we will continue the consultations and workshops with all of the sector stakeholders in both of the next two phases of work. You know, we spoke to, as Samiksha mentioned, 75 people in the first round. That is certainly a large number of people, but not necessarily everyone in the space. So we will continue to do our best to make sure that we're being diverse and representative, and including outside voices, as Michael spoke to, and making sure that we're not just talking to people that are involved in the clean cooking space, but talking to, as someone suggested in the chat window, funders that maybe are not involved in clean cooking, people from adjacent sectors that can maybe speak to some of the learnings from their space. So we'll be reaching out to many people to be involved in some of those consultations and workshops. And then we also wanted to make sure that we're having moments like this where we're opening up very publicly and sharing a little bit about the process and what we're learning through that process. So please do make sure that you stay on the lookout for future webinars, email updates. We'll be sending emails around to everyone that has registered through this. We have your email address. We'll share materials with you. We'll share updates with you so that you can make sure to attend some of these events in the future. And then finally, wanted to just plug the second part of this webinar series that we'll be holding next week on October 21st. We'll have an hour-long panel discussion with a few experts that work in some of the adjacent and overlapping spaces, really digging into how we might engage with some of those sectors in new ways, and really thinking about how we can start kind of catalyzing that. So hopefully all of you will join us for that session. You can RSVP through the same email you received here for joining this session today. So thank you everyone for participating in the call. We really appreciate having all of you here, and certainly hope that we'll hear from you a bit more in the feedback survey in the next couple of days.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.